Hi, I'm Dr. Andy Hemmings with the Oscilla Research Institute, and today we're going to do a brief introduction to some of the Pleistocene animals of North Florida. A lot of the animals that were then alive are still here, and we would call them extant. The animals that are still alive but no longer live in Florida are called extirpated. And then the really interesting things to us are about the 45 or so animals that are extinct, meaning they no longer exist anywhere. The mammoth and the mastodon are, really good examples of them. There was 3 kinds of ground sloths, not the tree climbers, but land sloths. That the small one, Megalonyx, was about 12 feet tall and probably weighed several thousand pounds. The bigger ones, Paramylodon, and the giant Eremotherium, are much bigger. Eremotherium, sitting on its hind legs, reaching up and browsing. They're eating a lot of branches and twigs and vegetation. Would be maybe 18 feet tall at the top of its head, and tip to tail from its nose back would be maybe as much as 22 feet long. So actually bigger than mammoths and mastodons. They're not the biggest animal here. Out west, there is another elephant, a relative of everybody who's got a trunk is called a proboscidean. The mammoth, mastodon have another one called Gomphothere. And out west, we know they existed until about 13,000 years ago. And we really suspect they were alive and well in Florida until that time, but it's an unproven thing right now, but we're working on it. But it suggests there might have been 3 different elephants here at one time, and most certainly mammoth and mastodon were here at the same time, which seems a little strange. How can that be? Well, primarily mammoths are grazers and eating a lot of grasslands. This is a cast of a mammoth tooth that you can see the big flat grinding surface, and what they're doing is just tearing up leaves. It's very similar to the surface you'd see in a cow or in a horse, another pair of grazers. Pleistocene horses were here, as well as a large form of the now extinct bison. Again, telling us a very interesting thing about the environment at the time, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. This is just a little baby tooth, a deciduous premolar, meaning that this fell out and they stuck it under their pillow, and heaven knows what the tooth fairy gives you for one of these guys. But the point to see here is how the crowns are very high, and they occlude or bite by overlapping each other, and they can crunch things. And you can tell just at a glance, one's more like cows and horses and eating primarily grass, and the other is primarily eating browse, bushes, vegetation in general, branches and leaves, even fruits. We found by actually finding the dung of mastodons in a couple places in the Oscilla River. One place it's about 15,000 years old, the other it's almost 35,000 years old, and tells us an awful lot about what was going on in the environment at that time. And I'll address that in a video really just about the environment in particular. But the point here is the elephants survived on the same landscape at the same time because they're not really in competition. They sort of butt up against each other. They overlap in their diets, but they focus on different things, and that's how they're able to get along and make use of much more of the environment. There's a lot of other things that go extinct with a particularly South American feel. They've immigrated from South America sometime in the last couple of million years, when the Central America is essentially formed, and we have connection between South and North America. The sloths come up from South America, a number of other things, some capybaras, tapirs, all of course which are no longer here in Florida, or certainly not native in Florida. Some have been reintroduced, or relatives have been reintroduced. Another one that's a real interesting animal that exists in one form, but not the big extinct Pleistocene version. And by Pleistocene too, I should point out, I mean specifically the Ice Age that lasted for about 2.1, 2.3 million years ago, depending on who you ask and what kind of argument they want to have, up to right around, to be as precise as we can right now, we'd probably say 11,800 years ago. And that's a geologic age, but it also means when did the last animals that go extinct, when did the last specimens of them go extinct? Meaning it has a geologic definition as well as a biological one in zoology. Well, this is part of the shell of an armadillo, and each little hexagonal or so piece is pretty tiny little bit of the shell, or the dermal armor is what you would call it. This is one individual piece of a giant version of the armadillo that was called Holmesina, and we've recently dated it, one of the few direct dates of it in the New World, to right at the same time as we have Clovis people across Florida and the New World. So we have a very interesting pre-Clovis occupation. We have at about 14,500 years ago, and again, lots of people by 13,000 years ago, meaning this animal was present in Florida for the better part of 2,000 years at least, while people were here before it goes extinct. So how much interaction, we don't really know directly, but we can put them in the same place at the same time in about a dozen places in Florida. So we suspect people were seeing them, whether they ate them or put ropes on them and raced them, we don't know, but they knew they were there. Mammoth, mastodon, the sloths, two kinds of capybara, which is a little fuzzy aquatic relative of the rodents. There was two of those. There was two kinds of muskrats, and one of them has left Florida that still exists, called Ondontra zibithecus. I hope that's not on your spelling chest. Ondontra zibithecus left Florida because it got too hot. And it's a real funny story. You wouldn't normally think, well, I don't know, maybe you would think. It's a real funny story about the muskrats, because one of them leaving because it gets too hot, and the other stays. I guess they could tolerate the heat coming out of the Ice Age. A similar story exists in the beavers. On my right, I have the skull of the Pleistocene beaver, Castoroides, that probably weighed 300 to 400 pounds. It would have been gigantic. And I say that and hold up the jaw of a modern beaver to give you an idea of how a beaver is a good-sized animal, but it is it pales compared to its ancestor that was here in the Ice Age. What's really interesting is we have the giant beaver in North Florida, but at sites farther south of Orlando, like at Vero Beach, where you have an incredible number of different animals, it didn't make it down there, or it doesn't appear that it made it down there. And I suspect even in the Pleistocene, it was a little too warm if you're wearing a fur coat all year round and weigh 300 pounds. Number of other interesting animals, and one that would have been almost assuredly hunted by early humans, we know it is in other parts of America 13,000 years ago, are the extinct pigs called Platygonus and Myohylas. And you say, oh, pigs, that's interesting. These are not what you think of when you go to a farm. They would have been basically at the top of their back, or at the top of their head, as tall as me, and I'm 6'2". They would have weighed several hundred pounds, if not close to 700-800 pounds, and they could run. They were very big. They're piglet. They are not. They're not friendly. In fact, Myohylas's the genus name and its species name is Nastius. Anybody named Nastius is not for cuddling, and it just suggests the interactions with people, limited as they are very real, and probably required the use of atlatls and darts, meaning you could reach out and touch them with a stick or a dart that you can launch rather than getting too close to them. But Nastius, a good last name to remember. One other really interesting group to talk about in the browser and grazer groups are the camelids. And by camelid, I mean the overarching family of camel-like animals. There are actual there is a camel named Camelops hesternus that gets no closer to Florida during the Ice Age than probably North Carolina. Maybe it's closer, but we've just never found it. But two of its relatives, distant relatives, Hemiakinia and Paleolama, are affectionately known as the stilt and the stout-legged llamas, were here at the end of the Pleistocene. And in fact, we found a couple of tools made out of the bones of Paleolama. So we know for sure that people overlapped with them, however briefly, after the first humans arrived in the New World, and specifically into Florida. But a lot of very different animals. And sort of at a general level referred to grazers and browsers, but the grazers tell us a really interesting story, and that it can include the llamas who are doing both grazing and browsing, but the bison, the mammoth, and the horse indicate that Florida was a very different landscape. It was not wall-to-wall forest from Pensacola to St. Augustine, that there had to be wide open grasslands, and in fact, all those browsers knock trees down, and the grazers maintain the habitat. And it's certainly mammoths, even though they're a grazer, are probably knocking trees down. And it's what the term you want to use is called terraforming, and it means that the big species that occupy that landscape maintain that habitat by keeping the grasslands open. We do it as humans. We're magnificent terraformers, not necessarily by ourselves, but with our tools and all of the wonderful products from Caterpillar. We can move a lot of earth, far, far more than mammoths and mastodons could. But they did enough habitat maintenance that it meant the grasslands persisted, and a lot of grazers that you would not expect, certainly in the historic period when we are a heavily forested, the whole eastern United States is heavily forested. It would be tough for mastodons and groups of mammoths and bison as well. Still, bison still exist east of the Mississippi into historic times, but in much, much reduced numbers. So the available animals on that Pleistocene setting when the first people get here are a very different suite of things than we would see even 10,000 years ago, and certainly in comparison to today. That who you had to worry about, who you could eat, who you could make your tools out of, who you had to share the water hole with, very, very different. And I'll use that as my segue into talking about the carnivores. And somebody with a sense of humor also named our good friend here, Smilodon fatalis, the deadly smile. And that's one of the saber cats. There's another cat every bit as big as this called the American lion. Individual male large specimens of the saber cat and of the American lion could weigh about 625 pounds. They were monstrous. And if they're social animals at all and not simply solitary hunters, how we behave as people today, when you came to work or school today, did you look behind you in case there was Smilodon fatalis or the American lion or the spectacled bear? Roughly the size of a grizzly, maybe a little bit bigger. It's a relative of the spectacled bear that still lives in South America. They actually look like they're wearing white goggles around their eyes, or black or brown, depending on how their coloring really looks. There was black bears as well. There's a black bear jaw. Same size as today, but there were, of course, much, much bigger animals. And the dogs are really interesting. The whole group of canids is a very interesting thing. There's a raging debate still going on about whether or not there's coyotes here, or if they are here in the Ice Age and vanish and come back later. Same with what version of the wolf is here, whether it's a red wolf, the timber wolf, a hybrid of something else. And it turns out that the dire wolf, and this is a part of what may well be a mask made from a young dire wolf jaw that is at least 13,000 years old. The dire wolves aren't actually dogs. They're related to other groups of animals. But between the lions and tigers, saber-toothed tigers, and bears, you would really want to behave differently when you go down to the water hole. One really overarching thing to keep in mind is people are one of the last arrivals. Probably come with domesticated dogs, which are going to help us a lot. Early warning, hunting, all of it. But the dog and people combination is very formidable and allows people to not only survive but thrive in an environment where animals like Smilodon and the American lion and the spectacled bear and the dire wolf and the mammoth and the mastodon, who did not evolve with humans around. They don't fear humans, certainly not at initially. And you end up in a situation where they're having been top predators or top animals in the food chain at the top of the pyramid of who's in charge. is really bad when people who hunt in packs or in groups and can talk and think arrive on that landscape. And there's been a raging debate within science for 100 years now of, did people cause these extinctions of so many animals? And the extirpation, where some animals survive but move out of the area. In the case of the horse, they move out of the New World entirely. Same with camels, they survive in the Old World but originated in the New World. We don't know. It's probably, there really isn't a single true answer. It's a combination of a number of things. Changing environment, shrinking landscape as the ice melts, and America itself just shrinks by about 12%. Florida shrinks by more than 50%, meaning that the landscape shrinks, plants and animal communities are reorganizing themselves, and oh great, we got people with sharp sticks and dogs that are now hunting everything that they can get at. Here are a couple of very early bone tools, a point, a gorge fishhook that's probably a little bit later, and a deer jaw that's been modified. Sometimes people call them canoes, but they still have the teeth in them, probably being used as a comb or a fine comb. It could be for, potentially for lice, but even just getting things straightened out. But I bring deer up in particular because they're everywhere today. They're one of the most important animals on the landscape. They're here today, so they are extant, as opposed to the extinct animals or those that moved away, the extirpated animals. And the reason I bring them up is we think of them as being everywhere. In the Pleistocene, deer in Florida and across North America are actually really quite rare. They're uncommon because they're just one of many large animals, and in fact, they're not really that large compared to a lot of the other grazers and browsers that are on that landscape. And as relative browsers, they graze too, of course, but they end up being in direct competition with the mastodon, probably the two kinds of llamas that are here, and a number of other animals. So in the absence of all those other animals, as we leave the Ice Age, the Pleistocene, and go into the Holocene, after the extinction of all those other animals, they thrive and they become ubiquitous. They are everywhere, much like the case with the bison, certainly farther west, where the bison, the herds grow into the millions. The deer population goes into the millions, if not hundreds of millions, over the next few thousand years. So a very different story a much happier story than, of course, what happens to all the animals that go extinct. But in the absence of all those other animals they were in competition with, they thrive. And that's a real interesting. I'll end with my favorite thought about the whole of all this. Somebody at some point coming into America, and I don't know if it's Louisiana or if it happened here in Florida, but some poor sucker was the first person to realize you can't outrun an alligator.